Monroe woke me several hours later. His touch shocked me, as if a powerful current of electricity moved between us. I felt it every time he touched me. Only when we were holding hands in the mist had I felt nothing. But maybe I was too focused on the sound of my heartbeat to notice anything else. He pulled his hand back quickly, and I sat up. Garrick was awake and watching us with cold eyes. I went to the rock wall and looked up. It was at least 10 feet tall and smooth as porcelain. I had never been very athletic in school, and this seemed like an impossible task. Monroe stood next to me and placed his hands on the stone. The rock shifted, and a bunch of grooves appeared in the wall, small crevices just big enough to be used for handholds. Garrick started climbing. He moved slowly and carefully, fitting his thick fingers into the tiny cracks. Monroe grabbed my arm as I approached the wall. Wait for him to get to the top. He's not as strong as he used to be, and we don't want him to crush you if he falls. His hand remained on my arm. My skin tingled under his fingers, but he did not let go. We were standing very close. Impulsively, I leaned in to kiss him, and he froze, and then pushed me away. It was so sudden that I lost my balance and went sprawling on the ground. He was immediately at my side, apologizing and helping me to stand. My face was hot, and I kept it turned away from him. I didn't want him to see my embarrassment. I felt foolish. He had made it very clear that he did not want a relationship with me, and I had forced myself on him. I should have been the one apologizing. Garrick called down to us. He had reached the top and was motioning for us to hurry. We went to the wall. Monroe smiled, and I looked quickly away. "Ladies first," he said. The climb was excruciating. My fingers could barely hold onto the small chips in the smooth stone. I slipped several times, and once fell off the rock and landed on Monroe. Somehow he caught me and held us both up while I got my hands and feet placed. After what felt like hours, I reached the top and threw my leg over the wall. I worried briefly about Monroe seeing up my dress before throwing myself on the shelf of stone, where Garrick sat waiting for us. My fingers were bleeding, and every muscle in my body ached. I started to lean over the edge to look for Monroe, when his boots swung over the top of the wall and just missed my head as I dodged out of the way. We sat on the ledge until our legs stopped aching, though mine still hurt when we stood to continue our journey. I stumbled dangerously close to the edge, but Monroe grabbed me, pulling me to safety and sending another jolt of electricity through me. I saw the look on his face and knew he felt it too, but he turned away with a pained expression. He led the way over a crumbling path cut into the stone, and Garrick followed, leaving me alone. This didn't seem like the best idea because I was unarmed and not much of a fighter, but neither man turned around. I tried to keep up but kept stumbling over rocks and banging my shins on protruding pieces of stone. After some time, the path grew wide and flat. It was then that Monroe turned and saw me struggling far behind them. His face filled with rage and his hands tightened around his staff. Garrick did not look at me. He was watching Monroe, waiting for him to do something. Monroe sighed and pushed past his father. He walked back to me and stood at my side. He didn't say a word or even look in my direction, but I felt safer walking next to him. Garrick turned occasionally to look back and glared at me while avoiding his son's angry gaze. The rock wall lining the path grew shorter as we climbed. The path was steep, and my legs burned with the effort. It ended abruptly and opened onto a flat expanse of rock on the top of the mountain. Monroe hurried forward, and I ran after him, leaving Garrick to plod along at his own slow pace. Monroe walked out onto a thin ledge, and I followed. The rock fell away on the sides, and my head swam as I stared down into the treetops far below. Monroe turned in time to see me sway and grabbed my arm before I fell. I leaned on him. My head was swimming with fear and attraction. He stood stiffly beside me, but placed his hand on my waist, where it was hidden from his father's eye by a fold of my dress. He stood a little closer than he needed to, and I was acutely aware of his scent. He smelled like fresh-cut wood and soil and a crisp fall day. He released me and moved out onto the ledge, motioning for me to follow. I followed with small, careful steps. The rock was solid and at least 4 feet across. I had no real reason to fear falling unless I tripped or was shoved from behind. I glanced warily over my shoulder at Garrick. Monroe stood at the edge of the ledge, looking out over the forest, which rolled beneath us in smooth green waves for miles. The view was spectacular, but I was overcome with another wave of terror and felt my knees go weak. I could imagine collapsing, grabbing at Monroe as I did, and accidentally knocking him over the side. My insides heaved, and I threw up on the rock. "Wow, you really don't like heights, do you?" His voice was teasing, but I heard a tone of worry beneath it that made me pull myself together and stand up. Monroe took out a harness from his bag. I eyed it warily. "What's that for?" He didn't answer, but briefly pointed at the end of the rock before continuing to untangle the harness. There was a wire attached to the end of the ledge. It ran down at a sharp angle into the trees. My stomach flip-flopped again, but I held back. I didn't need to embarrass myself more than I already had. Monroe finished untangling the harness and helped me slip it on. I could feel the energy bouncing between us as he fastened the straps. A long, thin wire ran through the harness and out the back. He took a large clip at the end of the wire and attached it to the one running out of the rock. I stood with my toes on the edge of the stone, staring out at the empty sky before me and trying to convince myself that it was a good idea to jump off a cliff, with my life protected only by a thin wire and a harness that resembled an old fishing net. Monroe sensed my fear and put his hand on my back. The shock of his touch nearly knocked me off my feet. He moved his hands in smooth circles over my back, and I shuddered. "Don't be afraid. I will be right behind you, and I promise I will not let any harm come to you. Do you trust me?" His head was bent over mine, and he spoke quietly into my ear. My heart raced, and every cell in my body was electrified. "Yes," I breathed. Without another word, he pushed me, and I fell forward off the ledge. I threw out my arms and screamed as I watched the treetops fast approaching. Chapter 15. As I flew through the trees, barely missing branches and swinging lightly from side to side, I realized that I was enjoying myself. Once the wire caught and held, fear left me, and I laughed as I zipped down into the trees, watching them rush by in a green blur. The speed left me breathless, and for the briefest moment, I felt free. The angle of my descent decreased, and I slowed down a little bit. As I rode out of the trees, I saw that I was quickly approaching a 2-story stone house with a thatched roof. Next to the house was a large pile of hay. I hurried to undo the clip and released it just in time. I landed with a bump in the haystack. I had just managed to roll myself out of the scratchy hay when Monroe burst out of the trees. He landed gracefully on his feet next to the haystack and laughed as he pulled a piece of hay out of my hair. "Have fun?" "That was amazing. I've never done anything like that before." "It makes the trip home a lot shorter." "Is this your house?" Before he could answer, Garrick shot out of the trees. His hands fumbled as he tried to undo his clip, and he smacked into the side of the house with a grunt. Monroe ran to him, and Garrick grudgingly accepted his help. When he had lumbered out of the haystack, we went inside the house. It was surprisingly clean and well kept. Monroe went to the fireplace and started a small fire, while Garrick stole into the kitchen with a guilty expression. I looked at Monroe. He shrugged, but his eyes were sad. "Years ago, a Rasky woman got him addicted to apple wine. She even taught him how to brew it. The Raskys enjoyed poisoning everyone they came in contact with. I can't tell you the joy it gave me to hear that you had defeated their king and prevented their return." "Has he ever tried to quit?" "Once. The withdrawals were so severe they almost killed him. It's a choice between 2 deaths, one fast and painful, the other slow and hazy. He's chosen to drink himself to death. I try to ignore it. He's not usually violent. He's just a shell of the great wizard he once was." Monroe was staring into the fire and absent-mindedly poking it with a stick. He seemed to forget I was there, so I slipped from the room and went to explore the rest of the house. The lower level of the house was split between the kitchen and a large open living room, which held the fireplace. I could hear Garrick banging around in the kitchen, and Monroe was still transfixed by the fire. I quietly crept up the ancient stairs. At the top was a hall lined with heavy wooden doors. I poked my head into the bathroom and bedrooms. I noticed that Monroe's room was immaculate and lined with shelves of books that stretched from floor to ceiling. I felt a little thrill at seeing his bed. There was a blue silk comforter spread over the large straw mattress. I quickly shut the door on my thoughts and hurried to the next. It led me to the study, another room bursting with books. There was a large desk facing the door and weapons mounted on the wall behind it. They were old weapons, their technology far outdated, but they were well taken care of, their blades sharp and gleaming in the light. I closed the door quietly and listened for any change downstairs. The last door was at the end of the hall, and by process of elimination had to be Garrick's room. I was curious to see what it looked like, to get some insight into the workings of his mind while he was preoccupied with his wine. I closed my hand around the heavy metal handle and listened again. I could still hear Garrick below. The banging was louder now, and accompanied by an occasional chuckle. I squeezed the handle. The door was locked. "What are you doing?" Monroe's soft voice made me jump, and I whirled around to face him. I tried to stammer out an answer, but my mouth refused to form the words. "You'd better go downstairs. I don't know what my father would do if he found you up here. He wishes the power of the witches back in the world, but he does not love them. A witch once broke his heart, and he has never forgotten it. The weaker he gets, the more I fear him. If his mind becomes as broken as his body, he may do something unexpected and violent. Try to make sure you are never alone with him. I do not trust him, no matter what oath he swore to you. This last time travel changed him. Did you notice?" I nodded. Monroe sighed and smiled warily. "Nothing about this quest is going smoothly. I will be happier once we are back at sea. It's safer out there, even with my father the way he is. It is said that Norg Hollow was located not far from our southern shore, before it drifted away from everything. Our trip should not be very long, if you know how to find true south." He smiled at my surprised expression. "I've spent years studying your history. I probably know more about the witches than you do." "That wouldn't be hard." We laughed. I was happy to see him laugh, but it was cut short by a roar from below. Garrick had just discovered we were missing. We ran down the stairs, Monroe going before me with his fists balled up at his sides, ready to fight. Garrick stood at the foot of the stairs, blocking our path. His eyes were red and his face flushed. He was breathing heavily. He looked like a bull about to charge. His eyes locked on me over Monroe's shoulder. "Stand back, Dad." Monroe's voice was low and controlled, but his anger was apparent. Garrick examined his son's face. He seemed afraid of Monroe. I could see the struggle between his fear and his hatred, but finally he relented. He moved away, and I followed Monroe into the kitchen. It was a large, modern kitchen, and the glossy black appliances looked foreign against the walls of stone and the grass roof. "There are some things in the other world that we couldn't live without. There is no law against bringing inanimate objects into the magical realm. In fact, it's quite common." Again, Monroe seemed to read my thoughts. "It's kind of shocking." He laughed. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Something more rustic. This is a lot nicer than the kitchen at Valencia's house." Garrick stormed into the room and grabbed an open bottle of the bright green apple wine. He took an angry drink, glaring at me the whole time. "Take it easy, Dad. We still need to get everything down to the dock." Monroe gestured to a pile of supplies against the wall. Garrick grunted and took another long drink. Monroe handed me 2 bulky bags of food before he shouldered a large crate. I followed him out the kitchen door and down a path that wound through a grove of trees and came out on a sandy white beach of another beautiful bay. There was another ship, slightly smaller and much more modern than the one we had before, that was docked offshore. The new crew was waiting for us on the beach. They were thin and wiry, but strong, with long black hair and thick beards. They kept their heads lowered and avoided eye contact as they took the supplies from us. Monroe spoke to them in a gruff language I didn't understand. It was loud and rough, like the barking of fierce dogs. One of them replied, with a quick look at Garrick, and half the crew went up the path, while the others loaded the supplies onto the small boat docked on the beach. Garrick grunted and sat down on a rock near the shore. He ignored everyone and silently stared out at the ship and drank from the bottle that he held wrapped in a cloth. Monroe took my arm and led me back up the path, stopping just out of view of the beach. He held my arms lightly in his hands and looked at me. "How are you feeling?" That was a difficult question. I was distracted by his touch and by his brilliant blue eyes. I was excited to continue our journey and nervous for what lay ahead. I couldn't speak, but it didn't seem to matter. Monroe smiled and wrapped his arms around me. I could feel his lips on my forehead. and the smell of him was all around me. A moment later, a twig snapped somewhere in the forest, and Monroe quickly pushed me away. His cheeks were flushed, and there was a strange, hungry look in his eyes. He turned his back to me and scanned the trees. I'm worried about my father. He's hitting the wine harder than usual, and he's too quiet. I don't like it when he gets quiet. It never leads to anything good. The crew was returning with the rest of the supplies. Monroe spoke to a man carrying a wooden cask on his back. He nodded and continued to the beach, bent low under his burden. Monroe watched him with solemn eyes. Garrick's wine supply. I hope it's enough. We walked back to the beach in silence. The crew had already finished loading the dinghy and were waiting for us. Garrick joined them. There was just enough space on the seat beside him for Monroe and I, but Monroe motioned them away, speaking gruffly. The boat pulled away from the shore and started toward the ship. I told them to get everything on board and then send the boat back for us. I forgot something at the house. We need to go back. I followed him up the path. He didn't look at me until we reached the house. Then he stopped at the door and smiled. Wait here. I sat in the sun while he went inside. Everything was warm and green. It smelled fresh, and I couldn't help thinking that I could be happy here. The breeze shook the leaves, and the bees hummed among the roses that grew along the house. I was investigating an overgrown vegetable garden when Monroe reappeared, tucking a small brown box into his pocket. He smiled when he saw me waist-deep in tangled weeds. My father dated a woman from Pavora who would only eat food she grew herself. He brought her back here for a few years, and she planted the garden. After she left, he let the weeds take over and hasn't touched a vegetable since. Isn't Pavora the place with the pirates? There are pirates everywhere. The people of Pavora are known for their expertise with animals. They can communicate with them. The woman Dad dated had a bird, a little yellow thing. She talked to that bird more than she talked to my father. Did the bird talk back? He laughed. No, not that I heard. Come on. They must have finished loading the ship by now. They had, and the dinghy was waiting for us when we returned to the beach. Monroe took my hand as I climbed aboard. Ready? I guess so. His smile made me nervous, more nervous than anything that lay in my future. It faded suddenly, and I remembered his uncanny ability to know what I was thinking. He checked to make sure the two crew members were out of earshot and looked at me seriously. Listen, Casey, I know how you feel. I feel it too, but I can't, Casey. I can't feel this way. You and I can never be anything more than what we are now. Do you understand? I nodded, and he released me. He moved to the bow of the boat and spoke to the crew. The boat started, and we were soon climbing aboard the ship. Monroe didn't speak to me again, and he and Garrick sequestered themselves in a room below deck, leaving me to wander the ship and watch the land disappear as we left the bay. When they emerged several hours later, I could see a change had come over them. In place of their sun-bleached clothes, they wore long blue robes, the color of the sky just before dawn. But that wasn't the only difference. Monroe appeared more stately and wise, while Garrick slouched behind him, subservient and glowering. He made his way to the bow, where he sat, quietly playing on a set of panpipes. Monroe passed me without a glance. His face was serious and a little angry. He gave orders to the crew and then sat poring intently over a large book. His concentration on the page in front of him was exaggerated, and the message was clear. He did not want to be disturbed. I turned back to Garrick. He seemed calmer after we boarded the ship. He was quieter and humbled, and I no longer feared him. The need to talk to someone brought me to his side. The men of the crew avoided me. They refused to look at me and quickly stepped out of my path as I approached. They spoke only the growling language and only in absolute need. Often they seemed to use telepathy to communicate, and it made me shudder to think they might be able to hear my thoughts. Garrick continued playing his pipes when I sat down next to him. He seemed unsurprised to see me. A smile turned the corners of his lips as he played. There was a light in his eyes that I had not seen before. He seemed happy, something I had not expected. The song ended abruptly, and he smiled at me. My son has chosen to follow his destiny. This makes me happy, though I am sorry for any hurt you may feel because of it. He will still honor and serve you as he has sworn to do. He is not the kind of man who breaks an oath. He took a drink. I had not noticed the bottle before, though it was in its usual place at his side. He grimaced before smiling again, his eyes aglow. I never told you about Selena, my first wife. She was a witch, one of your clan. I loved her so much. Still do. She's the only one out of centuries of women who I loved. You know why? Because I respected her. She was powerful. I just think that witches have a more powerful magic than wizards do. She's Monroe's mother, you know. That's why he's going to be so great and wise. A Deku. He sighed and smiled off into the horizon, obviously lost in some private memory of his wife. I started to move away, but he stopped me. I'm sorry. I was just remembering the day I met her. She made me so happy. He looked at me seriously. I am sorry for how I have treated you, Casey. Monroe's purpose in this life is to become a Deku. It was his mother's greatest wish, and he must fulfill it. Now that I know his choice, I wish you no harm, and would like to make amends for my previous behavior. He held out his hand, which I hesitantly took. All right, I guess. Dad, what are you doing? Monroe's voice was loud, and we both jumped at the sound. Garrick dropped my hand and scurried away. He bowed and apologized to his son with true fear in his eyes, but there was also a glimmer of hate. Monroe rushed to my side with a look of concern. He took my hand and felt my forehead. He looked at me carefully, as if he was searching for something. We stayed that way for a moment. Finally, he spoke. Don't ever let him touch you. I'm serious, Casey. I've chosen my path, and my father has sacrificed his powers to me. I am the dominant wizard now, but that does not mean that he is powerless. He can regain his power by stealing yours. He can feed off you, but only if he touches you. Promise me you won't let him touch you again. I did, and Monroe seemed relieved, but still angry. He left me alone to watch the night fall over the ocean. Garrick was suddenly at my side. He moved so quietly that I jumped when his face appeared beside mine, glowing in the low light of the moon. He smiled again. I was beginning to dislike the new Garrick even more than the old one. So the tides have turned. It is every father's dearest wish and greatest fear to have his son become better and stronger than himself. I am very proud of Monroe. I know he is afraid I will hurt you, and part of me wants to, I must admit. However, I know his heart, and no harm will come to you by my hands. I cannot continue this life much longer. I do not believe I will see the shores of Norg Hollow again, and perhaps it is for the best. I would rather remember it as it was in my youth. He turned suddenly. Monroe came around the corner, his face a mask of fury. Garrick smiled at me one last time and grabbed me roughly. Monroe ran at him, knocking him to the floor. I watched silently as they struggled. Garrick was not putting up much of a fight, and Monroe easily overcame him. He loosened his grip to allow Garrick to stand, and Garrick lunged at me once again. As I cried out, Monroe threw his father against the rail, which broke under his weight, and he toppled over the edge and was lost in the choppy waters below. Monroe retired to his quarters below deck without a word to anyone. I couldn't imagine the pain he was going through, and I hurried after him. I knocked lightly on his door. I could hear him moving around on the other side. Go away, Casey. His voice was muffled through the door, but I could hear his words catch in his throat. I just wanted you to know that it wasn't your fault. He wanted you to do it. He provoked you on purpose. The door opened. Monroe's face was ashen and haggard. His eyes were red and wet. He glared at me as I brushed past him and entered his room. I know. I could hear his thoughts, taunting and begging me at the same time. I know it wasn't my fault. It doesn't make it any easier. He sat down on his bed and crammed his fists into his eyes, fighting the tears that would not stop flowing. I sat beside him and took his hands in mine, but he wouldn't look at me. I know how much it hurts. I've lost a lot of people, everyone I ever cared about. The pain never goes away, but it will get better. It's a lesson. It stays with you and reminds you of why you have to continue on. He tried to pull his hands away, but I held on tight. Let me help you, Monroe. We can be friends, can't we? I don't think it's a good idea, Casey. It's hard enough just being close to you. I bit my lip and fought back my tears. I was hurt, but not ready to leave. Okay, I'll leave you alone. I only wanted to make sure you were all right. He didn't move. He remained on the bed, his shoulders slouched and his hands clasped before him. He kept his gaze on the floor, and as I closed the door, I saw a tear slide down his cheek. The crew was going about their work with little change to their surly demeanor. They barked orders back and forth in their rough language as I walked back to the spot where Garrick spoke to me last, his madness illuminated by the soft glow of the moon. The moon was glittering over the water, and I leaned carefully against the rail, watching the empty blackness in front of us. I slept little that night. My dreams were haunted with Garrick's wild eyes as he disappeared into the darkness. Valencia, Blade, and Evelyn each had cameo roles. Ghosts drifting into the story and out again with very little impact. It was Monroe who starred in my dreams. I was chasing him, through forests and deserts and jungles, until he vanished through a door into an impenetrable darkness. I woke with the first glimmer of dawn and went up to the deck. A few sleepy members of the crew roamed about, but the morning was mostly silent and empty. I knelt at the bow and watched the sunrise. Not a single cloud marred the open expanse of blue above, and a soft wind blew from the east. My stomach rumbled. I couldn't remember when I had last eaten, and was just about to go find something when Monroe was at my side, with a plate of dried meats, biscuits, and fruit. We ate in silence, both of us staring out at the endless sea. I wanted to speak, but his silence created a distance between us that I could not bridge. I was trying to block my thoughts when I heard Monroe gasp. My pocket was glowing. A golden light slipped through the fabric and warmed my thigh. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the compass. The needle was vibrating and, as always, pointed true south. Monroe looked at it and barked an order to the crew. We sailed for several hours. The compass danced in my hand as if it was excited to be approaching its home. I had to hold it with both hands to keep it from bouncing out of my grip and into the frothy waters below. When the sun had reached its highest point in the sky, the compass grew still. I held it on my open palm. There was a feeling of waiting. Something big was coming. Monroe had been at my side all morning, watching the needle holding steady while the compass bounced and jiggled. He waited with me now, and we held our breath for what was going to happen next. His hands came forward slowly and closed over mine, covering the compass. The reaction was instantaneous. Shafts of golden light shot from between our fingers, and the compass grew too hot to hold. We pulled our hands back, and the compass fell to the deck where it lay, bouncing and jittering, until it flew from the ship and burst into flames. The fire shot through the sky, leaving a trail of smoke and ash that hung in the air, marking our path. We followed the smoky trail, unable to see anything beyond the cloud of soot. Steam rose up from the sea, further obscuring our view. It was hot and dirty, but Monroe and I remained on the bow, peering into the gloom until our eyes burned, searching for the shores of Norg Hollow. We heard the rustle of the trees before we could see the shore. The smoky haze began to thin and revealed a dark mass of pine trees and a black stony beach. The ship dropped anchor, and we rowed the dinghy into shore. The stones that littered the beach were smooth, black, and glossy. They looked like the volcanic rock we had studied in 7th grade science. The forest was dark, but not fearsome. I felt the pull of those trees. I wanted to run into their shadowy depths and find whatever secrets they possessed. Monroe joined me on the beach, but the crew would not leave the dinghy. Their eyes were wide and fearful. It was clear that most of them had doubted the success of this voyage. They looked at me now, their eyes wide and afraid. Monroe spoke to them, and they nodded quickly and hurried back to the ship. No reason for them to sit there staring, Monroe said in answer to my unasked question. They will be happier on the ship, and this could take a while. What do I do now? I could feel the terror creeping over me. I had been so focused on finding Norg Hollow that I had no idea what to do now that I was here. Monroe didn't look worried. He shrugged. Explore. Get acclimated to your new home. We should see what buildings are still standing. The crew will need a place to live while we rebuild. You should find the Queen's quarters, and I will find a suitable place to stay. There is much more that we must do, but that's enough to start. Tomorrow we can decide how to rebuild an entire world." He said no more and sat tossing a flat black rock from hand to hand. I relied on him greatly to make this journey. I wanted his advice still, but it was my land. The reconstruction and repopulation of Norg Hollow could only be done by a witch, and I was the last. I felt the weight of responsibility settle over me, but I welcomed it. It felt right to be here. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere. I was home. I stood and brushed the sand from my dress. Monroe followed me, silent and smiling, as I entered the forest. There was a path, invisible from the beach, but I knew it was there. Valencia's memories were strong here. I could feel them alive inside of me, and it was almost as if she walked beside me, showing me the land of her youth. My heart ached for the crazy old woman, and I knew she would have been proud of me that day. The path wound through the trees. The ground was carpeted with orange pine needles, and the sun streamed through the branches, creating little patches of golden light. The smell was strong and soothing, and I inhaled deeply. I could feel myself growing calmer with each step. The trees ended abruptly, and we entered a clearing filled with the homes of my ancestors. The buildings were small and wooden, constructed from the same trees that surrounded them, and though they were musty, they were mostly intact. Even Monroe was impressed by the soundness of their construction. I could hear him exclaiming quietly to himself as we followed the road that led through the village and back into the forest on the other side. The path continued through the trees, and I felt a growing sense of urgency and excitement. My whole body tingled with anticipation. My heart was pounding in my ears, and for the first time since I laid eyes on him, I had forgotten about Monroe. There was a clearing ahead, and I knew in my heart that my home lay just beyond the tree line. I pushed back the last of the branches and stepped into the clearing. The Queen's house was no larger than the others, and no more ornate. It was a simple wooden house with a large porch and a swing. There were the remains of a garden next to the house and a stone walkway that led from the forest to the porch. I approached slowly. There was a part of me that knew that it was right. I felt alive here, excited and comfortable, but there was something nagging at me. I felt another presence in the house, and it was not entirely friendly or welcoming. I knew there were no more witches in Norg Hollow. The house should have been empty. Monroe took my arm. "I feel it too. There's someone else here." His whisper was so low I could barely hear it. I felt like I was hearing his thoughts while his lips moved silently. We moved forward a few more steps. Monroe's hand remained on my arm, and I clung to him. We paused, listening to the rustle of the wind through the pines and the gurgle of a nearby stream. Valencia's memories told me that there was a spring on the other side of the house. The stream was filled with ice-cold, crystal-clear water that refreshed and nourished the spirit, as well as being useful for cooking and cleaning. I wanted to see that spring. I let go of Monroe's arm. This was my home, and if there was someone in it, they were the ones trespassing, not me. The presence was not a strong one. Monroe and I were both far more powerful. There would be no battle. I continued down the stone path with more confidence in my step. I was almost to the porch when a shrill cry stopped me. Monroe was quickly at my side, and we heard the cry again. It was coming from inside the house. I took a deep breath. Monroe squeezed my hand, and I smiled as bravely as I could and stepped up onto the porch. I went to the door and started to knock, but stopped with my hand raised. This was my home. I lifted the latch. The door swung silently open, revealing a large, empty living room filled with golden sunlight. The floors were smooth and polished and shone in the light. Another spine-chilling shriek came from the second floor, and Monroe and I crept quietly to the foot of the stairs. There were footsteps above and a hushed male voice. The crying stopped. The heavy footsteps came closer to the stairway. A young man appeared at the top of the stairs. He was older than we were, probably 19 or 20, with chiseled features and chestnut hair. I felt my heart jump into my throat when he gave us a friendly smile and came down the stairs with his hand extended. "You must be Lady Casey," he said in his low baritone voice. "I'm Leaf Palma, originally of Pavora Cove." He shook my hand warmly. When he greeted Monroe, there was a little less warmth, and I could see a look of plain dislike in Monroe's eyes. "What are you doing here, Leaf? How did you come to Norg Hollow from Pavora? And what was that terrible sound?" The questions poured out of me. My voice surprised me. It sounded powerful and in control, and it took me a moment to realize that I was the one speaking. I sounded like the queen of a clan of mighty witches, and not just Casey Valdala, Crystal River's most unpopular teen. Leaf carefully considered my questions and heaved a great sigh. I couldn't help but notice the tightness of his shirt against his skin, and the muscles rippling beneath. It was absolutely beautiful. I have spent a great deal of time imagining this moment. It's been months since, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. I had a plan for how I would explain all this, but I can't remember a word of it now. I didn't expect you to be so young and pretty. I assumed the last witch would be older. Monroe made a displeased sound. He's avoiding your questions. Something's not right, Casey. Whoa, buddy, relax. I'm going to answer her questions. Just give me a second. He turned to me with an apologetic smile. I'm sorry. I haven't spoken to anyone in a while. I'm trying to remember how. He gave me a sad smile and turned his gaze to the windows. A cluster of butterflies swarmed to the flowers outside. Leaf sighed again. The truth is, I was a pirate. I was from a poor home in Pavora, but I knew I was intended for something much greater than working on my father's fishing boat and barely surviving year to year. My mother's side of the family has some witch blood. She's always had these strange powers. I have them as well. It's not uncommon in Pavora. A lot of witches and wizards stop there after crossing through the portal, and many of them went no further. Many families have magic in their ancestry. My mother knew that I was not meant to stay in Pavora, and she helped me in every way she could. She even befriended a pirate captain and got me a place on his crew. It was her final sacrifice for me. My father found out and tried to prevent me from leaving. I ran and made it to the ship, but I am certain he killed my mother. He had a bad temper and drank quite a bit. I stole a quick glance at Monroe, thinking of Garrick and his apple wine, but he was unmoved. His face was filled with distrust and hatred, and his eyes did not leave Leaf's face. Leaf grinned uncomfortably. So I became a pirate and did the terrible things that pirates do. I saw the world and did my share to destroy it. I don't claim to be a good person. This was directed at Monroe. However, I do not mean either of you any harm. I have sworn to protect Lady Casey until my end. Whom did you swear this to? Your sister, Meloda. My sister? I couldn't conceal my shock. We raided a small village not far from the southeastern portal. There was a woman tied to a tree in the middle of the village. She was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. You look like her. I would have known you were her sister, even if I had not known you were coming. Why was she tied up? For being a witch. It's not as accepted in the other world, but you both know that. They were burning her alive and had just lit the fire under her when we stormed in and started burning their homes. She laughed when she saw us. It was the most amazing sound. Amidst all the chaos and screaming, her laugh was clear and sharp. I think I fell in love with her at that very moment. I cut her ties and pulled her from the fire. She healed her wounds and joined us in destroying the village. She became a part of our crew, though she confessed to me that she had another quest. The same quest as you, Lady Casey. I helped her find the portal. I didn't have any other choice. I gave her my heart, and she had full power over me. We fought the pirates, the very crew that took me in and made me one of them. But I was so in love that I didn't regret a single death. I still don't. Love is worth more than honor to me. Monroe stifled a laugh, and Leaf shot him a dirty look. I smiled, encouraging him to continue, and Leaf smiled timidly in return. I was aware that there was a part of me that now had control over him. I used this power without even thinking about it, and I was startled to find that I enjoyed it. Leaf kept his eyes fixed on my face as he continued his tale. Once we entered the magical realm, it was difficult to locate Norg Hollow. The land was hidden for centuries, and though we did not know it then, Meloda was not the intended queen of the witches. She found it, though how she did it I have no idea. There was a distance between us after we crossed over. Our relationship wasn't as solid as it had been before. He fell into a brooding silence. Monroe and I watched him anxiously. He seemed sad. My sister had obviously hurt him, and I found myself angered by her careless treatment of his heart. I wouldn't mind having a man like Leaf madly in love with me. Monroe coughed and shot me an angry look, and I blushed. I forgot he could read my mind. I wished I could read his. He very obviously disliked Leaf, but I couldn't understand why. Leaf was charming and friendly and sweet. He had already sworn his loyalty to me and said that we need not fear him. I didn't know what else could be wrong. Monroe was tapping his foot impatiently, obviously growing more agitated with every silent second. I was just about to ask Leaf to continue when another howl split the air, making Monroe and I jump. Leaf just sighed sadly and ran his hand over his face. He looked very tired. "Leaf, what is that noise?" He gave me a weak smile. "If you'll follow me, I'll show you." He walked slowly up the stairs. Monroe gave me a strange, angry look, which I ignored, and I followed Leaf, with Monroe close behind me. Chapter 16. Leaf brought us to a small room at the end of the hall. He pushed the door open, and I gingerly stepped inside. The room smelled terrible, and the horrible screaming was almost deafening. In one corner of the room, bathed in sunlight from a nearby window, was a bassinet. The child inside was angry and red from screaming. Her little fists attacked the air and pounded the mattress. Instinctively, I reached into the bassinet and lifted the tiny squirming bundle and held her close. The screaming ceased and she snuggled against my neck. A strange feeling came over me. It felt very natural to hold this child against me. It felt primal, something long ago built into the genes of women, the nurturing gene. She needs her diaper changed. I don't know how I knew the child was a girl, but Leaf didn't correct me. I laid her gently on the changing table and held her wriggling body in place with one hand while I cleaned her. I had never held a baby before, and I had certainly never changed a diaper, but I just seemed to know how. The baby smiled at me, and it made me happy. It all felt right. I looked up from her smiling face and noticed that Monroe was gone. Leaf stood alone in the doorway, looking tired but a little more hopeful. "She likes you. I'm glad. She hasn't stopped crying for the last few weeks. I've tried everything, but nothing worked. I don't think she likes me." "Of course she likes you. How could a daughter not like her father?" A change passed over Leaf's face, fleeting but very real. It was a mixture of hatred and love and sadness, and the deepest pain I had ever seen expressed on a human face. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, and he smiled sadly. "She's not mine." His hands were clutching at the hem of his shirt. It was obviously a very sore subject, so I tried to move to more neutral territory. "What's her name?" "Pawn." "Pawn?" Leaf rolled his eyes. "It was Meloda's idea. I'm not sure what she was thinking." He tried to laugh, but choked on the sound. There were tears in his eyes. "I miss her so much." "Why did she leave?" I couldn't imagine how anyone could leave behind such a sweet little girl and a handsome, loving man. Leaf sighed again. "I'm not really sure. She found some scrolls, ancient writings of the witches. Something in them upset her, but she wouldn't tell me what it was. She left a few days later. There was no warning. She brought very little with her, and the supplies she did take she gathered while I was sleeping. I think she would have left without telling me, if it hadn't been for Pawn. She had to make sure I knew how to care for her, in case she didn't return." He stopped. I could see his pain. His face was red and his eyes wet. His jaw was clenched, and I could hear the sound of his teeth grinding together. He kept his eyes on the floor, but I could see his struggle. "Could you give me a moment?" "Of course." I took Pawn downstairs with me. Monroe was seated outside near the ruined garden. He helped me spread Pawn's blanket on the grass, and I laid her in the center of it. She gurgled happily in the sunshine and waved her hands in the air. Monroe watched her with a serious expression on his face. He inched away as she rolled over and started to crawl toward him. I laughed at his terrified expression. "She's not going to bite you, Monroe." "I'm not very good with kids. I don't have any experience with them." "Neither do I," I said as I picked her up and plopped her in my lap. She laughed and waved her chubby hand at a butterfly that floated past her nose. Monroe smiled distractedly. "Casey, I'm worried about this guy. Do you really believe his story about your sister?" I thought about Leaf's sad, hurt face and nodded. "Yeah, I do. Okay, you're the boss, but I'm going to keep an eye on him. Whatever you need to do. He grabbed my knee, sending a jolt through my body. I'm serious, Casey. Don't let this guy get too close. Monroe stood up suddenly and left to go explore the forest on the other side of the house. I sat in the warm sun watching Pon babble happily. I smiled as I watched her crawling through the grass. Leaf came out of the house. His face was composed and friendly. Sorry about that. I knew when Melota left I would never see her again, but I kept hoping I was wrong. We sat in silence. Leaf was pulling at the grass and watching Pon. Leaf, I know you don't want to talk about it, but I'd really like to know who Pon's father was. I feel like I need to know. Another sigh. It just sucks for me, you know? He looked at me with his eyes so full of hurt that I couldn't stop myself from grabbing his hand and squeezing it. He smiled and squeezed back. I had the feeling he had done this before, with my sister. We picked up an extra crew member in one village. I can't remember the name of it now. It started with a M. Doesn't matter anyway. He was a young guy, maybe a couple years younger than me, but he was really strong and a hard worker too. He kept to himself. There was one weird thing about him. Most pirates travel alone. They're not really the family man type, you know? But this guy brought his mom and his little sister with him. His mom cooked for us, and it was the best food any of us had ever had. His sister was a nightmare. She had tantrums like I have never seen, and my mom had 8 kids. If one of my sisters had done what that girl did, my mom would have smacked her. But they never said a word. It seemed like she was the one in charge. I couldn't speak. My thoughts immediately jumped to Blade. It could easily be true. I didn't want to think about it, but it could definitely be true. I cleared my throat. So he was the... I couldn't finish. Leaf was staring at his hands, sadly. Yes. It went on the whole time he was on the ship. She came back to me after we dropped him and his family off, but it was a struggle for her. She almost left with them. We were near her home, and she obviously preferred him to me, but she decided to stay at the last moment. I think he may have dumped her. Of course, I took her back without a word. What else could I do? She held my heart. Even after she left, she still had it. I could always feel her presence. And then one day it was gone. I looked up quickly. He was looking at me, and his lower lip was quivering. She's dead. She must be, or I would still feel her with me. He started to cry, and I held him. Pon sat in a patch of daisies, watching us, with her head cocked to one side. When he stopped shaking, I told him that we had found Melota's body. He nodded, but didn't speak. Pon crawled into my lap and began whimpering and sucking on her fingers. Leaf looked up. She's hungry. That one's easy. He followed me into the house and showed me where everything was to prepare her bottle. I cradled Pon in my arms and watched her drinking happily. The reality of my role in this little girl's life was dawning on me, and though the love I felt for her far outweighed my terror, I couldn't help the feeling of desperation that settled over me as she looked steadily up into my eyes. Leaf watched me silently. When Pon finished, I burped her and turned her loose in the grass. She crawled away, happily gurgling and cooing. I laughed to hear her simple joy. Suddenly, Leaf was on his knees before me. Tears streamed down his face, and his hands were clasped before him. Lady Casey, I swore to your sister that I would protect and honor you, and now I swear it to you. You have my life. I see in you the queenly airs that your sister lacked. Let me serve you, my queen. Let me be the first of your royal knights. He bowed his head, and I sat staring at his beautiful chestnut hair in disbelief. Do witch queens have knights? I really have no idea what I'm doing here. They had a few select defenders that were allowed to live in Norg Hollow. Please don't banish me, Lady Casey. I don't have anywhere to go. You may stay in Norg Hollow as long as you like, and I will accept your service. Thank you for sharing your pain with me, Leaf. I hope it will lessen in time. He blushed and thanked me before hurrying back inside the house. I watched Pon for a while, trying not to think about what Leaf had told me. My thoughts should have been on the future of Norg Hollow and where to begin the reconstruction, but it didn't hold my interest. Monroe came out of the house carrying a large load of papers and books. He dropped them next to me and sat down with a triumphant smile. The records and teaching of the witch queens throughout the centuries. We can use them to recreate the land. I read a little bit already, and there are witch buds in a hidden grove not far from here. His eyes were alive and his cheeks were flush with excitement. He was tapping a stick impatiently on the ground. What are witch buds? Pieces of witch souls, saved for a situation just like this. If we can find out how to bring them back, we can repopulate the land in a much shorter amount of time. Casey, are you okay? I swayed a little. My heart was pounding, but I tried to keep my voice steady. Do you think Valencia left a piece of her soul here? Could I bring her back? Maybe, but even if she did, she wouldn't be the same as when you knew her. Just similar. He gave me a worried look. I wouldn't get your hopes up. Pawn crawled over to me, and I picked her up and held her close. She snuggled against me and closed her eyes. Her body was warm against my chest, and I could feel her grow heavy as sleep took hold. She hadn't cried since I arrived. I smiled at her peaceful, sleeping face and kissed the tip of her nose. I looked at Monroe, who was watching me with tender eyes. I think I'll put my hopes on her. I may be the one to rebuild Norg Hollow, but she is its future. I kissed her again and offered her to Monroe. He tentatively kissed her on the forehead and smiled. I carried her up to her room and laid her in the bassinet. As I stood watching her sleep, tears filled my eyes, but I still could not take my eyes off of her. Whatever lay ahead for me, this little girl was the key. I just hoped I wouldn't fail her. This has been The Last Witch by M. Frappier. Copyright 2011. Audio copyright 2023. Frap Media. Thank you for listening.